At 9:07 a.m., the explosion shook windows 5 miles away. By 9:09, phones were ringing in Washington. By 9:12, orders were already being given, not to rescue, but to stay silent. Officially, it was called an accident. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. And by the end of that day in 1945, thousands of people would know the truth. And almost all of them would be forced to forget it. This is the story of the accident everyone helped cover up. April 1945. World War II is almost over in Europe, but not yet finished. The United States is operating at full wartime intensity. Factories, ports, railroads, and harbors working non-stop. One of those places was a quiet port town. Not famous. Not strategic in the public imagination. Just another loading point on the map. But what was being loaded there that morning was unlike anything civilians had ever handled before. Thousands of tons of high-explosive military material. Packed tightly. Poorly labeled. Handled by workers who had never been trained to deal with it. No warning signs. No evacuation plan. No emergency briefing. Because officially, nothing was supposed to go wrong. Witnesses would later describe the sound not as a bang, but as a crack in the world itself. A blinding flash. A pressure wave that flattened buildings. Steel torn like paper. People thrown hundreds of feet. 2 ships disappeared in seconds. The blast was so powerful it registered on seismic equipment, the kind usually reserved for earthquakes. Entire neighborhoods vanished. And yet, within hours, the official story was already forming. A tragic industrial accident. No further explanation. No technical details. No accountability. This is where the story stops being normal. Survivors were warned not to speak. Doctors were told to omit causes of injury from records. Journalists received direct instructions on what they could and could not print. Photographs were seized. Letters were censored. Military police appeared, not to investigate, but to control information. Families searching for missing relatives were given no lists. No confirmed numbers. No closure. And most telling of all, there was never a public inquiry. Not in 1945. Not later. Not ever. Calling it an accident solved everything. It avoided blame. It avoided lawsuits. It avoided uncomfortable questions about military negligence. But most importantly, it protected something much bigger than a port. Because what was destroyed that day was connected to a much larger operation, one that could not afford bad publicity or public fear. By the time newspapers hit doorsteps the next morning, the event had already been minimized, softened, and buried beneath wartime distractions. And soon, it disappeared entirely. But accidents don't require silence on this scale. So what really happened? And why did so many institutions, military, medical, and political, quietly agree to look the other way? To understand that, we need to look at what was being hidden, and who had the most to lose. Every cover-up fails in the same place. The details. And in this case, the details refused to stay buried. The first contradiction was the death toll. Official reports listed a number that changed repeatedly. Sometimes lower. Sometimes rounded. Eyewitnesses said it was far higher. Entire fire departments vanished. Medical staff disappeared from records. Some victims were never officially acknowledged as being present. Why? Because many of them were never supposed to be there. One of the most disturbing facts only surfaced decades later. The workers loading the ships had no training manuals. No safety briefings. No understanding of what they were handling. They were told only one thing: work fast. Some were even punished for slowing down. Military officials knew the risks. Internal memos warned of potential catastrophe. And yet, nothing changed. When the explosion happened, responsibility should have been obvious. Instead, responsibility vanished. Survivors and families eventually filed lawsuits. It should have been a landmark case. But something strange happened. Evidence was restricted. Witnesses were intimidated. Entire lines of questioning were shut down. And in the final ruling, the court concluded, no one was at fault. In American legal history, that decision remains almost unheard of. A disaster of massive scale, with no accountable party. For years, historians searched for complete records. They found gaps. Whole days missing. Reports marked, classified, long after any reasonable security concern had passed. Some documents were destroyed outright. Others were released decades later, heavily redacted. What was still being protected? Privately, some officials admitted the truth was simpler and more damning. Corners were cut. Warnings were ignored. Speed mattered more than safety. And when it all went wrong, the system did what it always does under pressure. It protected itself. By the time the public realized something was wrong, the narrative was already locked in. An accident. A tragedy. No further discussion. But history has a way of resurfacing. And the final piece of this story isn't about what happened in 1945. It's about why we were never meant to remember it. Cover-ups don't survive because they're perfect. They survive because people move on. Families never receive proper death certificates. Some bodies were never identified. Some were never recovered. For decades, survivors were told their memories were exaggerated, that they were confused, that it was just chaos. But trauma doesn't invent details, and the stories never matched the official version. This wasn't an isolated case. The same language appears again and again throughout history. Unavoidable. Tragic. No fault found. When institutions fail catastrophically, the word accident becomes a shield. Only many years later did quiet acknowledgments begin. Small memorials. Vague statements. No full apology. No admission of negligence. Just enough recognition to seem humane. Not enough to assign responsibility. The real damage wasn't just the explosion. It was the precedent. A lesson learned behind closed doors. That disasters could be buried. That accountability could be delayed until no one remained to demand it. History isn't just written by the winners. It's edited by the survivors. And censored by the powerful. The accident of 1945 wasn't just an explosion. It was a decision. A decision to stay quiet. A decision to move on. A decision that truth was less important than order. And the most unsettling part? It worked. So the next time you hear the word accident, ask yourself, was it truly unexpected? Or just inconvenient to explain? Silence doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in slowly, after the dust, after the funerals, after the last question stops being asked out loud. In the weeks following the explosion, the town was rebuilt quickly. Too quickly. Debris was cleared before proper documentation. Damaged structures were demolished instead of examined. Temporary housing appeared, then disappeared. The goal wasn't recovery. It was normalcy. Because normalcy prevents questions. Children were sent back to school. Workers were reassigned. Newspaper headlines moved on. And soon, the explosion became something people used to talk about. Survivors recall being given identical instructions, sometimes word for word. Don't speculate. Don't exaggerate. You didn't see what you think you saw. Some were told their injuries were unrelated. Others were advised that speaking publicly could be considered unpatriotic. This was wartime America. Silence wasn't framed as fear. It was framed as duty. Decades later, researchers noticed something disturbing. Medical records from that day contained vague language. Blood trauma. Unknown cause. Industrial injury. No consistent references to blast pressure. No official acknowledgement of chemical exposure. No detailed autopsies for many victims. This wasn't medical negligence. It was administrative direction. Not everyone stayed silent. Some spoke in private letters. Some recorded oral histories late in life. Some confessed to family members on their deathbeds. Their stories were consistent. They described chaos far beyond what was reported. They described panic among officials. They described orders being shouted, not about rescue, but containment. And again, one phrase kept returning. "This can't get out." A cover-up doesn't require a single mastermind. It only requires alignment. The military avoided scrutiny. Contractors avoided lawsuits. Government agencies avoided congressional hearings. No single villain. Just a system protecting itself from embarrassment and liability during a fragile moment in global history. In 1945, confidence mattered. The war was ending. The world was watching. The United States could not appear careless. Legal scholars still study the aftermath. A disaster involving massive loss of life. Documented negligence. Clear chains of command. And yet, no individual held responsible. No department officially blamed. No structural reforms immediately enacted. The ruling effectively stated that wartime necessity outweighed civilian safety. That idea would echo for decades. Some records remain sealed to this day. Not because they reveal enemy secrets. Not because they compromise technology. But because they show decision-making. They show who knew what and when. And those documents threaten a carefully preserved narrative. That the disaster was unforeseeable. It wasn't. This is the hardest part to accept. Most people involved weren't evil. They were tired. They were overwhelmed. They were afraid. Speaking out meant careers ending. Reputations destroyed. Families targeted. So they chose the safer option. They chose silence. History has a strange habit. It waits until no one powerful is left to offend. When some documents were finally released, few noticed. No press conference. No national apology. No major headlines. Just PDFs uploaded quietly. But inside them were confirmations. Warnings ignored. Safety protocols skipped. Concerns dismissed in favor of speed. The word accident appeared less frequently. The word avoidable appeared more. Eventually, a memorial was built. Simple. Respectful. Vague. It acknowledged loss. But not responsibility. No mention of decisions. No explanation of failures. A place to mourn, not to understand. Children of victims grew up with unanswered questions. Why were death certificates incomplete? Why were stories dismissed? Why did no one apologize? Some spent years researching. Some gave up. Some turned their findings into books, documentaries, or lectures. They weren't chasing revenge. They were chasing acknowledgement. This isn't just about 1945. It's about how institutions respond to failure. The language used then is still used now. Unprecedented. Unavoidable. Under review. The pattern didn't end. It was perfected. The explosion lasted seconds. The silence lasted generations. When we call something an accident, we imply no one could have stopped it. But sometimes, an accident is simply the final step in a long chain of ignored warnings. The truth didn't disappear. It was buried, deliberately, under urgency, fear, and convenience. And the most uncomfortable question isn't what happened in 1945. It's this. How many times since then have we accepted the same explanation? History doesn't repeat itself loudly. It repeats itself quietly, behind closed doors, in sealed files, and in stories we're told not to remember.